Picture this, it's dawn in a medieval city, 14th century Florence, let's say. Cathedral bells are ringing out their bronze hum, shaking dust from the crucifixes, waking the bakers, the butchers, the priests chanting their first prayers. The stone spires glow faintly gold in the sunrise, a beacon of holiness, right? But hold up 3 alleys over just a stone's throw from the cathedral square. Another kind of business is already in full swing. The brothel doors creak open, straw beds are swept, and a red ribbon flutters above the entrance signaling flesh for sale. This isn't some seedy underworld secret. This is normal. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where the holiest cities in Europe ran on sin, taxed it, and called it necessary. If you thought medieval life was all about knights' castles and pure Christian virtue, buckle up, because the truth is so much dirtier than your history books ever let on. You might be thinking, wait, prostitution in the Middle Ages, wasn't that like illegal or hidden in dark corners? Nope. That's the first myth we're shattering today. Prostitution wasn't just tolerated, it was organized, regulated, and profitable. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London didn't just turn a blind eye, they built entire systems around it. In 1348, Florence passed laws setting up state-run brothels, not to stamp out vice, but to control it, to make sure men's lust didn't spill over onto so-called respectable women. These weren't shady backroom deals. Brothels had tax numbers, paid fees to the city, and get this, even the church got a cut discreetly funneled through civic treasuries. We're talking about a world where a bishop might preach fire and brimstone about purity at dawn, then sign off on brothel taxes by dusk. Hypocrisy. Sure, but in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a scandal, it was a business model. Let's zoom in on Florence for a second, because this city was ground zero for medieval sin management. After the Black Death wiped out half the population, the city was desperate to rebuild its economy. So they opened official brothels, complete with rules about who could work there, how much they could charge, and where they could operate, usually right near the city center, not hidden in some sketchy outskirts. One brothel, the Honesta, was so legit, it had its own municipal overseers, like a medieval HR department for sex work. The logic: better to have men visit a brothel than seduce a merchant's daughter or, God forbid, a nun. It's like they decided sin was inevitable, so they might as well slap a tax on it and call it a public service. Now you might be wondering, how does a society that built cathedrals to glorify God justify profiting off women's bodies? Easy, they called it a necessary evil. The church didn't run the brothels, but it didn't shut them down either. Instead, it created this twisted moral loophole. Let a few fallen women absorb the sin so the rest of society could stay pure. Sounds like a cop-out, right? But back then it was gospel. Priests would say it was better to channel men's desires into a controlled space than let them run wild, disrupting marriages or defiling virgins. And the city loved it because those brothel taxes paid for bridges, baths, even church bells. That's right, the same bells calling people to prayer were funded by the very women the church wouldn't let near its altars. Here's where it gets really wild. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. By regulating prostitution, the church and city got to decide who was pure and who was damned, who belonged in the cathedral, and who was stuck in the brothel. It was a system built on control, not chaos, and it worked because everyone bought into it: priests, magistrates, even the men who paid for the service. You don't learn this in history class, but the medieval city wasn't just a place of faith and glory. It was a machine that ran on the suffering of women it labeled as disposable. For the Americans out there, think about this. Like a modern parallel industries we know are exploitative, like fast fashion or gig work, still thrive because they're necessary for the economy. We shake our heads at sweatshops halfway across the world, but we still buy the clothes. Back then, people shook their heads at brothels, but they kept the system running. The Middle Ages didn't invent hypocrisy, they just perfected it. And the women caught in this machine, they weren't just victims of lust, they were the collateral damage of a society that needed someone to blame for its own sins. So if this glimpse into the dirty underbelly of medieval life has you rethinking everything you thought you knew about the past, stick around. Hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. Up next, we'll dive into what it meant to be a public woman, a label that wasn't just a job, but a life sentence. Trust me, you haven't heard the half of it yet. Waking up one day to find your name scribbled in a city ledger, not as a person, not as a daughter, but as a thing, a public woman, a feminina publica. In medieval Europe, that label wasn't just a job description, it was a life sentence. Once you were registered as a prostitute, there was no erasing your name, no rewriting your story. You weren't just working in a brothel, you were the brothel, a piece of civic property, tax-tracked and owned by the city's laws. If you think that sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, buckle up, because this was the reality for thousands of women in the Middle Ages, and it was all perfectly legal. Today we're peeling back the curtain on what it meant to be a public woman, a label that stripped away choice and turned human beings into permanent outcasts. Let's set the scene. It's 14th century London, and you're standing in Southwark, just across the Thames from the city's glittering spires. This is the Bishop of Winchester's turf, where brothels called stews line the streets, each one licensed and regulated like a medieval Starbucks. These weren't shady operations. They had official ledgers, and every woman working there was listed by name, age, and sometimes even the price of her services. One record from 1385 lists a woman named Agnes, 17 years old, charged a penny per client, her name inked next to a tax payment to the bishop himself. Agnes wasn't a criminal hiding in the shadows. She was a registered feminina publica, a public woman whose existence was as official as the butcher or the baker. But unlike them, Agnes could never quit. Once her name hit that ledger, it was permanent. No appeal, no escape, no second chance. Here's the gut punch: this wasn't about women choosing a profession. Most didn't walk into a brothel thinking, hey, this seems like a great career move. They were pushed there by a system that saw them as tools, not people. The city's magistrates decided who got labeled a prostitute, sometimes based on nothing more than a rumor or a single act. In 1377, a London court branded a woman named Margaret as a feminina publica because she was caught serving drinks in a tavern after hours. No evidence of sex work, just a vague accusation, and boom, her life was over. Her name went into the register, and from that moment, she was legally defined by what the city said she was. It's like being put on a modern sex offender registry, except you didn't even commit a crime, just existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now let's talk about what this label meant. Being a feminina publica wasn't just about working in a brothel, it was about losing your humanity. These women couldn't own property, testify in court, or even walk into a church without permission. They were barred from respectable society, their lives reduced to a line in a clerk's book. In Cologne, Germany, 15th century records show prostitutes had to carry special permits just to leave their designated district. Think of it like a scarlet letter you had to flash to move around. If you didn't have your permit, you could be fined, whipped, or worse. And forget about privacy. City officials could barge into brothels at any time to inspect the women, making sure they were following the rules. It was control dressed up as bureaucracy, and it was relentless. You might be thinking, okay, but didn't some women choose this life for the money? That's a myth we need to crush right now. Most women in these ledgers were there because they had no other options, poverty, abandonment, or a family that sold them off. The idea of choice in a world where starvation was one bad day away is as absurd as thinking you choose to drown when you're thrown into a river. These women weren't entrepreneurs. They were survivors trapped in a system that decided their fate before they could even speak up. For Americans today, it's like imagining a world where a single accusation could lock you into a job you hate forever with no way out. No resignation letter, no fresh start, just a label that follows you to the grave. This system wasn't a glitch, it was deliberate. Cities like London and Cologne didn't just tolerate prostitution, they needed it to function. By branding women as feminina publica, they created a class of people who could be exploited without guilt, taxed without question, and erased without consequence. It's not so different from how we sometimes look the other way at modern injustices like workers in sweatshops or migrants in detention centers, because it's just how the system works. Back then, the system worked by turning women into public property and nobody blinked. If this is making you rethink what you thought you knew about the Middle Ages, good, that's the point. Stick with us, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep digging. Next up, we'll uncover the visible cage these women were forced to wear, the yellow dress that marked them as both available and untouchable. Trust me, it gets even wilder from here. Picture yourself walking through a bustling medieval market, vendors hawking bread kids, dodging carts, priests clutching rosaries. Suddenly, you spot her, a woman in a dress so yellow it burns like a sulfur flame in the sunlight. Her hair's uncovered, no veil, no hood, just loose strands catching the breeze. Everyone sees her. They have to see her. That's the point. This isn't just fashion, it's a brand, a cage made of cloth that screams, "This woman is for sale." In the Middle Ages, prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing, like a yellow dress or scarf, not to advertise their services, but to mark them as outcasts, visible to all, touchable by none, unless you paid the price. If you thought medieval society hid its sinners, think again. This was public shaming dialed up to 11, and it was all part of the plan. Let's dive into the yellow dress, the cruelest uniform in history, and why it wasn't just about style, it was about control. Let's head to 14th century Venice, where the city council decided prostitutes needed to stand out like warning signs. In 1384, they passed a law mandating that every public woman wear a yellow scarf or dress bright, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. This wasn't some subtle accessory. It was a color that itched the skin, chafed the shoulders, and stained everything it touched, from the collar to the hem to the eyes of every passerby. One record tells of a woman named Lucia, fined in 1392 for trying to cover her yellow scarf with a shawl. Her crime, trying to blend in to look like someone's sister or wife for just one day. The punishment was a public whipping in the Piazza San Marco, right where the tourists snap photos today. The message was clear: you don't get to hide. Your body belongs to the city, and the city wants everyone to know it. This yellow wasn't the golden glow of a saint's halo. It was a sickly, bile-like shade chosen to disgust as much as to signal. In Florence, some prostitutes had to wear striped cloaks like a medieval barcode, while in Milan it was bells sewn onto their skirts, jingling with every step. Imagine the humiliation. Every move you make announces what you are before you even open your mouth. And it wasn't just about being seen, it was about being excluded. These women couldn't cover their hair, like respectable women couldn't wear a veil to church, couldn't even walk near the cathedral during a holy festival. In 1416, a Siena court recorded a prostitute named Caterina, beaten for standing too close to a procession on Easter Sunday. Her yellow dress was supposed to keep her away from sacred spaces, like a force field of shame. You might be thinking, okay, but wasn't this just about making sure clients could find them? That's what the city wanted you to think. But here's the real kicker. The yellow dress wasn't about helping business, it was about punishment. The visibility was the point. When a woman walked to the market for bread, people parted like she was contagious. Mothers pulled their kids away. Men stared, then spat. The dress didn't just say, "I'm available." It said, "I'm not human." It's like wearing a modern-day ankle monitor, except everyone can see it, and it never comes off. For Americans, think about online shaming, doxing, or viral call-out posts that brand someone as canceled. Now imagine that brand is a physical dress you can't take off, following you everywhere forever. Here's where it gets even darker. The rules were enforced with brutal precision. A prostitute caught without her yellow marker could be fined, whipped, or worse. In 1370, a London court ordered a woman named Ellen to have her hair cut off for wearing a hood over her yellow scarf. Her one bit of personal pride gone because she dared to shield herself from judgment. And these punishments weren't hidden. They happened in public squares with kids watching, men jeering the same men who might have paid her the night before. The city didn't just want these women visible, it wanted them humiliated, a walking reminder that stepping out of line had consequences. This wasn't random cruelty, it was strategy. By making prostitutes stand out, the city ensured they could never blend in, never escape their label. It was a way to keep sin contained, to draw a line between the pure and the damned. But let's be real, that line was drawn by the same people profiting from it. The yellow dress wasn't just a garment, it was a tool to keep women in their place, to make sure they carried the weight of society's judgment every single day. It's a chilling reminder that control can look as simple as a piece of cloth, but feel as heavy as a chain. If this glimpse into the medieval branding machine has you shook, stick with us. Smash that subscribe button, because we're about to step inside the brothel itself, where the real horrors of daily life waited. Trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. A dimly lit room, the air thick with the stench of sweat and cheap herbs. The floor is strewn with straw that scratches like needles underfoot. A chipped bowl sits in the corner, filled with murky water that hasn't been clean in weeks. A cracked mirror hangs on the wall reflecting nothing but shadows and shame. This isn't a dungeon, it's a medieval brothel, the so-called house of pleasure that was anything but. For the women trapped inside every day was a grind of pain, performance, and survival, their bodies and souls worn down by a system that saw them as tools, not humans. If you thought the yellow dress was cruel, buckle up, because life inside the brothel was a nightmare you can't unsee. Let's step through that creaking door and face the brutal reality of what these women endured. We're in 15th century Paris, in a brothel tucked just off the Seine, where the city's rules kept women like Jeanne, a 14-year-old listed in a 1470 court record, working from dawn to midnight. Her day started with a slap if she didn't move fast enough. The madame, think of her as a medieval pimp with a ledger, demanded Jeanne paint her face rouge, her cheeks, and smile like she meant it, even if her ribs ached from a client's rough hands the night before. The beds, just straw pallets crawling with lice, changed only when they got too bloody to ignore. Meals were scraps, stale bread, maybe a thin soup doled out at set hours to keep the women weak enough to obey, but alive enough to work. If Jeanne hesitated, vomited, or cried, the madame's response wasn't comfort. It was a backhand or a day without food. This wasn't a job, it was a prison with no walls. The physical toll was relentless. These women faced constant abuse, bruises hidden under powder cuts, doused with stinging herbs to ward off infection. Disease was a death sentence waiting to happen. Syphilis wasn't widespread yet, but other infections like gonorrhea or skin sores were rampant in medical care. Forget it. A 1423 Bruges record notes a woman named Margaret who died at 19 from an untreated pelvic infection, her body tossed out like garbage when she couldn't work anymore. The brothel didn't care about healing, it cared about profit. Women were forced to shave, bathe in caustic herbs, even douches with vinegar that burned more than they cleaned all, to keep up the illusion of desirability for clients who didn't care if they were bleeding underneath. But the real horror wasn't just the physical, it was the emotional gut punch. Imagine being Jeanne, barely a teenager, taught to suppress every human instinct. Smile when you're in pain. Whisper sweet nothings to a man who smells of ale and violence. Bite your tongue so you don't scream when he shoves you down. A 1450 Dijon court record describes a girl, Marie, fined for disobedience because she refused a client who beat her too hard. Her punishment: no food for 2 days, and the next client got her for free. The brothel didn't just break bodies, it broke spirits, training women to detach, to make their eyes go dead while their mouths played along. It's like being forced to act in a play where the script is your suffering and the audience pays to watch. You might be thinking, didn't some women find a way to cope? Maybe even thrive? That's a Hollywood myth we need to burn to the ground. Sure, some learned tricks, how to flatter a client, how to fake a laugh, but those were survival tactics, not empowerment. The brothel wasn't a place for thriving, it was a meat grinder for the soul. For Americans, think about modern trafficking victims, forced into sex work, told to smile for clients, their every move controlled. The medieval brothel was the same, just with worse plumbing. These women weren't working girls chasing a dream. They were prisoners performing for their lives, knowing one wrong move could mean starvation or worse. This brutal existence wasn't an accident, it was designed. The brothel's rules, the madame's ledger, the city's inspections, they all worked together to keep women compliant, disposable, replaceable. Every chipped bowl, every straw bed, every slap was part of a machine that chewed up human beings and spit out profit. It's a stark reminder that systems don't need chains to trap people, just enough rules to make resistance impossible. If this peek into the brothel's horrors has you reeling, stick with us. Trust me, it's a story you won't forget. A muddy village in 14th century England, the kind of place where winter bites harder than the wolves. The fields are barren, the harvest failed again, and a family of 6 huddles around a dying fire. The father's hands shake as he hands his youngest daughter, barely 12, to a stranger with a coin purse. No goodbyes, no tears, just a handshake, and a girl who doesn't yet know her life is over. This isn't a story of choice or rebellion. It's a story of desperation, of a world where poverty pushed girls from villages to city brothels faster than you can say survival. If you thought these women ended up in brothels because they wanted to, brace yourself, because the truth is way uglier. Let's follow the path from village to vice, and uncover how the Middle Ages turned desperation into a one-way ticket to hell. Let's zoom in on 1349, right after the Black Death swept through Europe like a grim reaper on steroids. Half the population's gone, fields are abandoned, and villages are ghost towns. In places like Norfolk, England, families were starving, and girls were the first to pay the price. A court record from 1350 tells of a girl named Emma, just 13, sold by her father to a tavern keeper in London for 2 shillings, about a month's worth of bread. He didn't look her in the eye as she was led away, her small bundle of clothes clutched tight. That tavern keeper, he wasn't hiring her to pour drinks. He was a recruiter, one of many who scoured villages for girls to feed the city's brothels. Emma's name shows up a year later in a Southwark ledger listed as a feminina publica. Her childhood ended the moment she crossed the city gates. This wasn't rare, it was routine. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it shredded the economy, leaving rural families with nothing but debts and hungry mouths. Girls were sold abandoned or sent to cities to find work, but work meant brothels. In 1360, a Florence record notes a girl named Beatrice, 11 years old, left at a city brothel by her uncle after her parents died in a famine. No one asked her if she wanted this. No one cared. The madam took her in, not out of kindness, but because a young face meant higher prices. These girls weren't running toward vice, they were pushed by hunger, by family, by a world where a daughter's body was just another asset to liquidate. You might be thinking, couldn't they just say no, run away, do something else? That's a modern fantasy we need to torch right now. In a medieval village, saying no meant starvation, not just for you, but for your siblings. There were no safety nets, no shelters, no job boards. If you were a girl, your options were marriage, servitude, or the streets, and the streets usually led to a brothel anyway. Recruiters, often tavern owners or traveling merchants, knew this. They'd offer a coin or a promise of work to desperate families, knowing full well where these girls were headed. It's like modern human trafficking, where predators target vulnerable kids with promises of a better life, only to trap them in a nightmare. The Middle Ages just made it legal and called it business. Here's the darkest part: once a girl was handed over, her past was erased. No baptismal record, no family name, just a new identity as a commodity. In 1375, a Bristol court recorded a girl named Joan, 14, who tried to return to her village after a month in a brothel. Her family turned her away, calling her tainted. The village priest wouldn't even let her through the church door. She was back in the brothel by week's end, her name inked into the city's ledger. The system didn't just trap these women, it made sure they had nowhere else to go. It was a pipeline from poverty to prostitution, greased by desperation and sealed by shame. This wasn't a glitch in the medieval world, it was the blueprint. Cities needed brothels to function, and villages supplied the raw material, young disposable girls. The Black Death famines, even wars like the 100 Years' War, churned out more orphans and broken families feeding the machine. It's a brutal reminder that when society crumbles, the most vulnerable pay the price. For Americans today, think about kids caught in modern trafficking rings, lured from broken homes, or foster care promised a future delivered into exploitation. The medieval village was no different. It just didn't bother hiding the transaction. If this journey from village to vice has you gut-punched, hold on tight. Smash that subscribe button, because next we're diving into the church's role, not running the brothels, but making sure they stayed open. Trust me, the hypocrisy is next level. A medieval cathedral at sunrise, its stained glass saints glowing with holy light, a priest's voice echoing psalms of purity. Now picture this, just 3 streets away, a brothel hums with business, its profits quietly funneled into the church's coffers. The priests don't run the place, but they don't shut it down either. Instead, they preach fire and brimstone on Sunday, then look the other way as the city taxes the women they call sinners. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's a masterclass in moral gymnastics, a system where the church kept its hands clean while cashing in on the very sin it condemned. If you thought the Middle Ages were all about divine justice, get ready, because the church's role in prostitution is a plot twist that'll make your jaw drop. Let's step into 15th century Cologne, Germany, where the cathedral's shadow loomed large, but so did the brothels. In 1452, city records show the local archbishopric collecting a cut of brothel taxes through municipal middlemen. Think of it as a sin laundering machine. The church didn't touch the coins directly, It let the city do the dirty work, then pocketed the cash for alms candles, even cathedral repairs. One ledger lists a payment of 10 guilders from a brothel called Zum Rosengarten to the church's treasury, no questions asked. Meanwhile, the priests were preaching that sex outside marriage damned the soul. The same women they refused to let near an altar were funding the candles that burned for their sermons. Talk about a holy hustle. This wasn't a one-off, it was policy. At the Council of Basel in 1431, church leaders debated how to handle prostitution, not to ban it, but to regulate it. They argued straight-faced that brothels were a necessary evil to keep men from worse sins like seducing virgins or, heaven forbid, priests. Thomas Aquinas, the big-shot theologian, had already laid the groundwork a century earlier, writing that prostitution was like a sewer in a palace, disgusting but necessary to keep the rest clean. So the church gave its silent nod. In Paris, priests would bless a new city districts knowing full well a brothel was opening down the block. No excommunications, no crusades against vice, just a quiet agreement that some women's souls were worth sacrificing for the greater good. Here's the sickest part: the church didn't just profit, it controlled the narrative. Prostitutes were barred from confession, denied burial in consecrated ground, even refused baptism for their kids. A 1380 Avignon record tells of a woman named Isabel turned away from a church when she tried to pray for her dying child. The priest said her soul was too stained to approach God, yet that same priest parish got a cut of her earnings through the city's taxes. It's like a modern politician railing against corruption while pocketing campaign funds from shady donors. Same game, different costumes. The church called these women fallen to justify their exclusion, but it was their suffering that kept the system running smoothly. You might be thinking, didn't anyone call this out? Nope, that's the genius of it. The church's silence was louder than any sermon. By framing prostitution as a necessary sin, they dodged accountability. Priests didn't need to visit brothels to benefit. They just had to keep preaching purity while the city did the math. It's like today's corporations outsourcing sweatshop labor. Nobody at the top gets their hands dirty, but the profits keep flowing. For Americans, think about the opioid crisis. Companies pushed pills. Doctors looked away, and the system called it healthcare. In the Middle Ages, the church played the same game, letting women's bodies pay the price for a holy society. This hypocrisy wasn't a flaw, it was the foundation. The church needed prostitutes to exist not just for the money, but to define what purity meant. Without sinners to point at, how could they sell salvation? It's a brutal lesson in how power works create a scapegoat profit from their pain and call it divine order. The women in those brothels weren't just victims of lust, they were casualties of a system that needed them to stay broken. If this dive into the church's double dealing has you seeing red, stick with us. Hit that subscribe button, because next we're tackling the impossible question: could these women ever escape? Spoiler alert, the answer's as grim as it gets. A young woman, let's call her Elena, standing at the edge of a medieval city, her yellow dress itching against her skin, her heart pounding with a wild, reckless hope. She's got a few coins sewn into her hem, a stolen moment to dream of a life beyond the brothel's straw beds and leering clients. Maybe she'll find a convent to take her in, or a kind stranger to marry her, or a new city where nobody knows her name. But before she takes a single step past the city gates, the truth hits like a fist. There's no way out. The Middle Ages didn't just trap women in brothels. It built a labyrinth of laws, stigma, and fear to keep them there forever. If you thought these women could just walk away, buckle up, because the system was designed to make escape as impossible as flying to the stars. Let's head to 1420 Augsburg, Germany, where a woman named Greta tried to break free. A court record tells us she was 19, a brothel worker who fell in love with a baker's apprentice. They planned to marry, move to a nearby town, start fresh. But the moment she left the brothel, the madam reported her to the city magistrates. Greta was dragged back, fined for abandoning her station, and whipped in the town square while her lover was banished. Her crime wasn't theft or violence, it was daring to want a different life. The city's ledgers didn't just track her earnings, they tracked her. If she ran, her name was shared across jurisdictions, her yellow dress a beacon for anyone hunting her down. It's like being on a medieval most wanted list, except your only crime was trying to be human. The barriers weren't just legal, they were social, carved deep into the bones of society. Take Maria, a Venetian prostitute in 1460 who begged sanctuary at a convent, hoping to trade her yellow scarf for a nun's habit. The Mother Superior turned her away, quoting scripture about defiled flesh tainting holy ground. Maria's story, recorded in a convent's ledger, ends with her back in the brothel, her spirit broken. Even if a woman found a man willing to marry her, the past clung like damp rot. In 1375, a London woman named Alice posed as a widow in a new city, but a former client recognized her. The town council didn't punish her for lying. They sent her back to the brothel under threat of arrest. Her new neighbors, even her would-be husband, turned their backs. Once you were a public woman, society saw you as nothing else. You might be thinking, couldn't they just save up bribe, someone start over? That's a fairy tale we need to burn to ash. Brothel earnings went to the madam or the city, not the women. Any coin a woman hid was a risk. Madams searched their clothes, their beds, even their bodies. If caught, you'd be beaten or starved. And where would you go? No landlord would rent to a woman with no family, no trade, no respectable name. No employer would hire her. Even begging was risky. Cities, fined or jailed. Vagrant women assuming they'd return to prostitution anyway. It's like modern trafficking survivors trying to rebuild society, says, move on, but slams every door in their face. The medieval system didn't just trap these women, it made sure the world outside was as cruel as the one inside. Here's the gut-wrenching truth: the escape wasn't just hard, it was designed to fail. Some women tried repentance, praying until their knees bled, but priests turned them away, saying their sins were too carnal for absolution. Others tried running to another city, but medieval Europe was a small world for marked women. A 1390 Nuremberg record notes a woman named Clara caught after fleeing to Munich. Her yellow cloak gave her away, and Munich sent her back to face a whipping. Even death wasn't an escape. Suicide attempts were stopped not out of compassion, but because a dead prostitute was a loss of profit. The madam's ledgers didn't just track money. They tracked every defiance, every tear-turning hope into leverage to keep women in line. This wasn't a system with cracks, it was a fortress. Every law, every sermon, every neighbor's sneer was a brick in the wall, ensuring no woman could climb out. For Americans, think about the foster care system or homelessness, people trapped not just by circumstance, but by a world that refuses to see them as more than their label. The medieval brothel was a machine that didn't just exploit, it erased any chance of redemption, leaving women to drown in a life they never chose. If this story of locked doors and shattered hopes has you raging, stick with us. Hit that subscribe button, because next we're asking the big question: what does this medieval nightmare teach us about the systems we live with today? Let's pause for a moment and take a breath. We've walked through the muddy villages, the brothel's straw-strewn rooms, the yellow dresses that burned brighter than shame. We've seen how the medieval city turned women into sacrifices, calling their suffering necessary to keep society pure. But here's the question that lingers like smoke. What does this tell us about ourselves? The Middle Ages are long gone, cathedrals are now tourist traps, and nobody's taxing brothels anymore. But the logic that built those systems, it's still alive, hiding in plain sight. If you thought this was just a grim history lesson, think again, because the medieval prostitute story is a mirror reflecting the sins we still ignore today. Buckle up, because we're about to connect the dots from their world to ours, and the view isn't pretty. Back then, the church and city needed someone to carry the weight of sin so everyone else could feel clean. They called it a moral necessity, but it was really a deal with the devil's sacrifice, a few women to protect the honest ones. Fast forward to 2025, and we're still playing that game, just with shinier packaging. Take human trafficking right now. A 2023 UN report estimates 50 million people are trapped in modern slavery, many in sex work, forced labor, or sweatshops. We shake our heads, call it tragic, but keep buying the cheap clothes, the fast food, the gadgets made by hands we'll never see. Just like medieval priests preaching purity while pocketing brothel taxes, we condemn exploitation, but fuel the systems that thrive on it. The women in those yellow dresses, they're still here in massage parlors, in border camps, in factories, where the air chokes more than it cleans. Let's talk specifics. In 15th century Florence, the city justified brothels to protect noble daughters, but the real goal was control over desire, over morality, over who got to be pure. Today, we see the same logic in debates over sex work. Some argue for legalization to protect workers, But others say it just formalizes exploitation, trapping people in a system that profits off their bodies. A 2021 study from Baylor University found that even in legalized sex industries, like in parts of Nevada, workers face stigma and violence at rates not much better than in illegal markets. The medieval city didn't invent this hypocrisy. It just wrote it in Latin. We're still wrestling with the same question: can you regulate suffering without endorsing it? Spoiler, the answer's messy and nobody's hands are clean. You might be thinking, we're better than that now, right? We've got laws, NGOs, human rights. Sure, we've made progress, no more yellow dresses or public whippings. But don't kid yourself. The medieval system thrived because it made suffering normal, invisible, just part of the city's rhythm. Today, we do the same with essential workers in gig jobs or migrants cleaning houses after dark. We call it the economy, not exploitation. A 2024 report from the International Labor Organization says 160 million people work in conditions close to forced labor globally. We don't see them because we're not supposed to, just like medieval folks didn't see the women in yellow unless they paid for it. The lesson: if a system makes someone's pain necessary, it's not a mistake, it's a feature. Here's where it gets personal. The medieval prostitute wasn't just a victim of men or madams. She was a casualty of a society that decided some lives were worth less. Every time we scroll past a news story about trafficking or buy a $5 t-shirt without asking where it came from, we're part of that same math. It's not about guilt, it's about waking up. The Middle Ages teach us that purity, whether it's moral or economic, always comes at a cost and someone's forced to pay it. For Americans, think about the kids in foster care funneled into trafficking or the workers in Amazon warehouses racing against timers. We call it progress, but it's the same old script: someone's got to be the sacrifice so the rest of us can sleep easy. So what do we do with this? First, don't look away. Research the brands you buy, the policies you vote for, the systems you're part of. Support groups like the Polaris Project, fighting modern trafficking, or local shelters helping survivors rebuild. And yeah, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this, raw, unfiltered, human, need to be told. Drop a comment. What necessary evils do you see in our world today? Who's paying the price for our comfort? The medieval prostitute story isn't just history, it's a warning. The question is, will we listen, or will we keep building cathedrals on someone else's bones?